Chairman Xi Jinping's cult of personality has become so tight that he's centralized power to himself far more than the emperors of old or even Mao Zedong. And when you do this, a number of things come from it. So, for example, the power outages that happened in China back in May, it's entirely possible, highly likely, that Xi wasn't even informed about them until September, because he has literally shot the messenger so many times that nobody wants to bring him bad news. We didn't get a real policy to deal with that until last month. So we've been having rolling blackouts. Just gives you an idea of the information vacuum that Xi Jinping is operating under. We also have some fairly credible reports, in my opinion, that indicate that Xi didn't know that the war was going to happen at all until he read it in the paper the next day. His own intelligence folks had no idea, or they were unwilling to bring him a reasonable presentation of what was going on in Eurasia. And so he just went with his conversation with Putin, the first conversation he had had with a foreign leader, face-to-face in over 2 years, and that was the end of it. The Chinese vaccine doesn't work. It probably is only about 10 to 15% effective versus death against the Omicron variant. So we know that the Chinese system is in a degree of lockdown. We know that the zero tolerance policy for COVID is going to continue because they dare not let it up. They're also facing a demographic collapse, trade challenges, and let's say an Olympic process with the Paralympics are not exactly going very well from a PR point of view. I know it's all been Russia, Russia, Ukraine, Ukraine for the West, but in the rest of the world, they're looking a lot more at the propaganda that the Chinese are putting out, and it's taking on a desperate hinge. So if you're Xi or the Communist Party, and you know that economics and demographics and security are turning against you, you've got to find another pillar of support, and that is not health, because the vaccine doesn't work. Food security. Unfortunately, 2 to 3 years ago, the Chinese suffered from a big outbreak of African swine fever, and over the course of those 2 years, they culled over 2/3 of their herd. They culled more heads of hog than the rest of the world has in commercial farms. Since then, they've tried to rebuild it, providing grants and subsidies to anyone who can go out and start a hog herd. So we got 2 million people who entered the business of raising hogs who had never done anything in agriculture ever before. Phytosanitary operations are practically non-existent, and I would be shocked if the Chinese are not already experiencing a second round of African swine fever. So if you're Xi and food security is one of the few things left, and you can't count on pork, all that's left is rice. Now, China is the world's largest exporter of phosphate-type fertilizers because they have to be the world's largest producer of them, because phosphate is primarily, from the Chinese point of view, a rice fertilizer. So you can see here the chunks of the market that the Chinese are good at. The bottom two are by far the most important because those are the two primary derivations of phosphate-based fertilizer. And the Chinese have banned their exports. So even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were already dealing with a first-order effect fertilizer shortage that was already global in scope because the single biggest player in the market stopped. I do not expect the Chinese to reinstitute fertilizer exports this year. It's entirely possible that they will never do it again because the Chinese system has so few legs left to stand on. Food security is one of the few things, and rice is the only thing that they can control themselves. And so they are. So phosphate fertilizer, very bad position. Let's talk about nitrogen. Here's oil and natural gas investment globally. Back in 2014, a narrative took place in the Wall Streets of the world that fossil fuels were dead, so why would you invest in it? Over the next 7 years, investment dropped by 60%. On average, it takes 3 to 8 years to bring a new oil and gas project online if it's conventional, assuming we have the money, which means that the price environment that we're seeing even before the Ukraine situation kicks in, that was going to last for a minimum of 3 years because of a lack of supply. Even if we all doubled our investment in a day, which is happening now, you should not expect to see significant improvements in supply before 2025. And of course, we do have the war. So here's this fun little map again. These pipelines here, they're going to stop. assuming for the moment that the Europeans don't sanction them, and I'm not really expecting that, they're going to get blown up either by the Russians by misfiring a few things, or by Ukrainian partisans who start blowing up infrastructure that they perceive benefits the Russians. It's going to be very easy for them to cross over into Belarus and do the same thing. So from that, you should expect significant drawdowns in the ability of the world to access Russian outputs, specifically Russian natural gas outputs. Natural gas, of course, is what we use to make nitrogen-based fertilizer. Here's US prices at Henry Hub. You can see that even with the spikes from the Texas freeze and more recently shortages in production, that we never really breached 6 for more than a couple of days, and we're already back in the general facility, or is the general range of 4 to 5. But in the United States, shale production is different from the global norm. It's closer to users, it requires less transport, it's less vulnerable to disruption, and most importantly, it doesn't take as long to bring online. If all the pieces are in place, from the time you start working on a shale well, you're talking 3 to 8 weeks until it's producing. If the prices are expensive, like are in some parts of the United States right now, it's still never going to be more than 8 months. So we have a price control situation here that the rest of the world doesn't have. And here are the prices up until the end of February for the Europeans and the Asians. Keep in mind that a lot of the natural gas that is used in Europe, and the vast, vast majority of natural gas that is used in Asia, is not piped. It's brought in by tanker via LNG. That's a far more expensive way to do it. And so anytime you have a disruption in the system, the price break between piped natural gas and tankered LNG is going to widen in addition to the general price elevation. We don't have finished March data. Obviously, we're only a week in, but we saw prices in Europe pipe up to $65 just 4 days ago. So this is not the state. This chart is not the state of affairs. This is the best we should ever expect it being in Europe and Asia, because we now can anticipate significant volumes of Russian crude and especially natural gas to fall offline and not come back. Probably half of natural gas coming out of Russia is going to fall off within the next couple of months, and all Russian LNG exports from Sakhalin and from Yamal are going to fall off before the end of the calendar year. The Europeans are turning in part to liquefied natural gas to replace the Russian piped gas, which means that the price is only going to go up more. When natural gas prices skyrocket like this, the people who use natural gas have to make choices. I mean, do we use it to make plastics? Do we use it to make fertilizer? Do we use it to keep the lights on? And in Europe, we're already seeing those decisions needing to be made, and they're making them. So Yara, the Norwegian fertilizer mega company, has already slowed output from all of their European locations because the price of natural gas has risen to the point that they're having to make choices between fertilizer and power. And they're choosing power. So we're at the leading edge of a massive shortage in nitrogen-based fertilizer. It started in Europe. It's going to spread to Asia very, very quickly because that price disconnect is huge in Asia because almost all of the natural gas they use is imported via LNG. Let's talk Russia. Again, you've got that red hash where the Russians plan to stop. The red is natural gas pipelines, and the green is oil pipelines. Now, oil and agriculture are expressly not covered in the sanctions that have put on Russia to date, but insurers are refusing to cover ships operating in the northern half of the Black Sea, and ship captains are refusing to dock at St. Petersburg. So we have a de facto global sanction on Russian agricultural exports already. Now, Russian ports are not sufficiently deep to take full ocean-going tankers or cargo vessels. It's relatively small, the size of vessels that can dock. So even if ship captains and insurers allowed it, and even if the sanctions don't cover these sectors in the future, they will still need to reload somewhere else. So the degree that things have to go perfectly right for Russian agriculture to continue to play a global role just is not going to happen this year. The general outrage is so high, and the insurers are so hostile to the very concept of picking up or even sailing into Russian ports that you should count on most Russian output being locked up. Now, that might loosen in a few places, but you should now count on that being the norm. About the only single spot where there may be an exception is Turkey could use its navy to escort vessels in and out of the Russian Black Sea ports and offer sovereign indemnification insurance for the vessels in order to supply itself and maybe a handful of countries in the Middle East that it would like to influence. But that is really the only player here that has the interest and the capability to do anything. Everything else is going to be locked down. Any other exports from Russia must be by rail, and the Russian rail system is already maxed out. So any sort of increases are going to be very incremental. In addition to all those problems, the Russians have another one. All these pipelines, they're all going to get shut down or blown up. And all of the exports that used to go out are going to back up in the pipeline system until you reach the wellheads. Then the Russians are going to have to shut production down. And a quirk of the Russian geography, whether it's weather or the permafrost, suggests that that production will be offline for a minimum of several years, if not permanently. We've seen this before. We saw this in the collapse of the Soviet system where they had a lot more petroleum engineers in order to shut things down safely. That is not the case today. Most foreigners are out already, and the Russians are going to have to do them themselves. And they have proven time and time again that technically they do not have the skill set to do this well. So all in all, we're talking about roughly 4 million barrels of crude daily falling offline within the next 2 to 3 months. You should consider that it's going to be offline permanently. And that 4 million barrels per day is actually not as bad as it sounds, because Russia is also the world's second largest exporter of refined oil products. It exports about 2.5–3 million barrels per day based on who's doing the math. Almost all of that comes from the ports that are already effectively shut down. So Russia will probably fill up all of its storage for crude and for refined oil products this month. And very soon thereafter, they're going to have to shut everything down. Now, high energy prices obviously means higher diesel and bunker fuel prices, which means higher agricultural prices. And that's before you get into fertilizer, which we will get to later in this presentation. But Russian exports are now functionally limited to rail, and even within that, functionally limited to their existing pre-war rail customers. They do not have the rolling stock. They do not have the capacity to add more customers above what they're already doing for rail. The system is rickety. It's not sufficiently maintained. It frequently browns and blacks out. Again, Turkey is probably the only exception to that. All right, let's talk crops. This is 30% of global wheat. All the dark browns are where most of the world's wheat exports come from. Ukraine and Russia have always been the fourth and fifth for Ukraine, and second or first for Russia in terms of their role in global systems. Corn, it's a Ukraine story. Ukraine is the only large-scale corn exporter in the Eastern Hemisphere. It's primarily used for animal feed. And then, of course, sunflower oil, which is the preferred cooking oil for this part of the world. But as we will see, just because most countries don't use sunflower oil, you remove that from the market, and anyone else who uses cooking oil, which is everyone, has to juggle through a supply reshuffling because a large part of the world is still going to need it. They're going to have to use something else. So these three products are what is driving most of what's going on in agriculture from a first order effect, but there's definitely some second order effects. We'll talk about those as we go. On the left, you've got wheat. On the top right, you have seed oil. On the bottom right, you've got corn. The orange is where I'm worried in the short term. We know, because of Ukraine falling off the map and Russia being severely curtailed, we know we're going to have wildly insufficient food production globally this year, just from the first order effects. That is going to affect different countries differently on a different time frame. The countries that are in orange are all Middle Eastern, and all of them get the vast majority of their food imports from Ukraine plus Russia. They now simply will not have what they need. In 2010, which was the last time we had any sort of meaningful disruption out of this space, wheat prices in the Middle East tripled. That generated, among other things, the Arab Spring. We are looking at a total disruption this year at least 6 times as large as what we had in 2010. And again, that assumes nothing else goes wrong. That assumes just first order effects. Now, of these 3 categories, wheat is by far the most important because there is not a substitute for it, and it is almost exclusively for human consumption. When you're talking about corn, you're talking about something that is primarily used as animal fodder, not exclusively, but primarily. So if that were to vanish, obviously there would be huge impact on prices, but it's not going to generate the sort of famine and instability effect that a shortage of wheat will. And as depressing as these 3 charts are in terms of who suffers the most, before I go on here, take a look at that top right one, the seed oil. You'll notice that the single largest category is India. We're already seeing follow-on effects, second-order effects in South Asia from the disruptions that are coming out of Ukraine, even though we're not technically in shortage yet. This is not the season when the Ukrainians and the Russians are normally exporting things. But in anticipation, we're already seeing a lot of panic buying in South Asia, and we're only going to see that intensify over the course of the next several months when it becomes obvious just how much damage the Ukrainian sector is going to feel. Here's Russia. The Russians really don't play in corn, so it's primarily a seed oil and a wheat issue. Once again, a lot of orange. When we think of the Arab Spring, we think primarily of Egypt, which is one of the world's largest wheat importers. But I would underline that Iran and Turkey are not in significantly better positions. Yes, they do grow a larger percentage of their wheat themselves for domestic consumption, but in terms of just the raw exposure, you remove Russia from the market, and it's very difficult to see these two countries continuing. I am more worried about Turkey than I am with Iran. Iran already gets the majority of the Russian and their Kazakh wheat by rail. That's just the infrastructure. That does not play true for Turkey. Turkey is much more dependent upon seaborne exports, which is one of the reasons why I think that we might see some sovereign indemnification. Now, within Russia, it's not that Russia is going to disappear from the market like Ukraine, but it's going to shrink substantially, catastrophically, as both a producer and an exporter. The production is already extremely inefficient. Of their roughly 140 million acres of agricultural land, 63% of that is controlled by one of only 35,000 farms. Russia is far more vertically integrated in this space than any other country in the world. And those enterprise farms provide almost all, somewhere upwards of 85 to 90% of total exports.